She said my cows were a public health threat because they mooed too loud. Next day, animal control knocked, but not just for me. Turns out, her little yappy dog didn't have a single legal paper. No chip, no license, not even shots. And the best part? They took him. Right in front of her. All because she called them on me first. That was the moment everything changed. One phone call from Karen turned into a full-scale neighborhood investigation, a court battle, a viral Reddit post, and more chaos than I ever expected on my peaceful ranch. But let me start from the beginning, before the barking and the mooing turned into war. It all began a few months after Karen moved in next door. My land borders the back end of a suburban development. It's technically private ranch land, not part of the HOA, but close enough that the fence lines touch. I've lived here for over a decade, minding my cows, fixing my fences, and waving at the occasional dog walker from a respectful distance. It was quiet. It was simple. That changed the day Karen decided she didn't like the way my cows looked at her. The first time she came by, it was 7:42 in the morning. I remember that clearly because I was holding a half-eaten egg sandwich when I heard someone screaming over the fence. I walked outside, thinking something was wrong. Maybe a dog had gotten loose or someone fell. Nope. It was just Karen, in fuzzy pink slippers and a silky floral robe, yelling that one of my cows winked aggressively at her from across the property line. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. She actually wanted me to discipline a cow for inappropriate eye contact. That was my first real encounter with her, and I wish it had been the last. Over the next few days, she escalated quickly. She left a laminated note taped to my gate demanding I move the cows between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. so they wouldn't interrupt her meditation schedule. She complained that the cows mooed too loud, smelled too strong, and even accused them of trespassing. I checked my cameras. My cows were still in the same fenced paddock they'd been in since 2011. Karen, on the other hand, had been spotted tossing orange peels and some kind of essential oil packets over the fence. I figured she was trying to get the cows to go away on their own. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Then, one Saturday afternoon, animal control pulled into my driveway. I wasn't panicked, just confused. I keep my animals clean, vaccinated, and well documented. The officer stepped out, looked around, and said, "We got a complaint about livestock noise and possible neglect. Mind if I look around?" I laughed and offered him a fresh lemonade while showing him the pasture. My cows trotted up to him like they'd been waiting all week for a visitor. He looked at the feed logs, checked the water systems, and gave me a high five for having a cow with a name tag that said Melissa. That officer left with a smile, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Very wrong. Karen was just getting started. She started standing at the edge of her yard with a notepad and stopwatch, timing how long each cow mooed. She wore noise-canceling headphones and made exaggerated faces anytime she caught my eye. She called the sheriff one morning claiming I was deliberately harassing her by positioning the cows in view of her kitchen window. The deputy showed up and immediately asked if I was hiding a camera crew for a prank show. I wish I had been. To make things weirder, Karen had a dog. A small, yappy, bug-eyed little thing that barked like it had swallowed a megaphone. It barked at everything. Cars, leaves, shadows, my cows. She claimed it was a rescue and a registered emotional support animal. She even said he had advanced training and could detect toxic vibes. I didn't care what kind of dog it was until she used him as evidence. She claimed he barked constantly because he was traumatized by the cows. That's when I knew she was planning something bigger. Sure enough, a few days later, animal control returned. This time, it wasn't just a courtesy call. They had a full inspection order based on anonymous reports of animal cruelty, insufficient shelter, and signs of bovine distress. It was laughable. My barn is cleaner than some restaurants I've eaten at. But I cooperated fully. I showed the officers every corner of the property, all vet records, digital temperature logs, and even footage from my barn cameras. They looked stunned. One of the officers leaned over and whispered, "Honestly, we don't even want to be here. But a report like this requires a 360 check." I nodded and asked what happens next. He said something that made me pause. "When we receive a formal cruelty complaint, we're also required to inspect all domestic animals within a 2-property radius. That includes your neighbor." That's when it hit me. Karen had kicked open a door she didn't realize had a mirror on the back. They knocked on her door politely. She didn't answer. They waited. Eventually, she came storming out in a bathrobe, holding her dog like a hostage and shrieking about privacy rights and conspiracies. The lead officer asked for basic paperwork: vaccination records, license, ESA certification. Karen froze. She said the papers were with her lawyer. Then she said they were in her storage unit. Then she said her printer was broken. It was clear she didn't have anything. The officers calmly handed her a notice. She had 24 hours to produce legal documents or face seizure and fines. Karen ripped the paper in half, threw it on the lawn, and called the police. When the sheriff arrived, he sided with animal control. Apparently, this wasn't her first time calling in bogus complaints around the neighborhood. One neighbor said she called the city on him for planting tomatoes. Another swore she tried to get his chickens banned for wearing bandanas. I watched all this from my porch, sipping sweet tea, with my cows gathered behind me like a row of very judgmental spectators. Karen stood on her porch, frantically calling someone while her dog barked nonstop at a plastic lawn flamingo. The sheriff asked her again if she had the dog's paperwork. She didn't. And that's when everything flipped. Animal control gave her a formal notice of seizure. The officer gently took the dog, scanned it for a chip, and found nothing. No registration. No vaccinations. No license. No ESA status. She screamed, cried, accused everyone of stealing her baby, and even tried to block their truck. It was like watching a soap opera written by farm animals. As they drove away, Karen collapsed on her porch, sobbing dramatically. Meanwhile, I received a follow-up from Animal Control later that day, officially closing the case on my cows and praising my record-keeping. I asked the officer if this kind of thing happened often. He said, "Only with HOA Karens who forget their own house is made of glass while throwing rocks." And that, my friend, was just the beginning. What came next? A courtroom showdown, HOA politics, and a Reddit post that went more viral than her dog's fleas. But for now, let's just say that calling animal control on my cows was the last mistake she made before the neighborhood turned against her. The next morning started off just like any other. The sun peeked through the eastern clouds, and the dew still clung to the grass when I stepped out to feed the cows. But today there was a strange energy in the air. It wasn't the weather. It was the knowledge that Animal Control had officially launched a wider investigation, and Karen had unknowingly brought the spotlight directly onto herself. I didn't have to do anything. She had done it all with her own mouth. By accusing me of cruelty, she triggered the kind of full neighborhood response she clearly never expected, and now it was her turn to deal with scrutiny. Around 10 in the morning, a familiar white truck pulled into my driveway again. It was Officer Delaney, clipboard in hand and that same tired but amused expression on his face. He was a seasoned guy, mid-50s, with graying hair and an easy kind of confidence that made animals trust him immediately. He didn't knock this time. He just waved, called out my name, and walked straight to the barn, smiling at the cows like old friends. He chuckled as Melissa walked up to him and licked his sleeve. I could tell he genuinely liked his job. He wasn't there to hassle people. He was there to make sure animals were safe, regardless of who lived next door. He asked if I had a minute to talk, and I nodded. We stood in the barn's shade, leaning against the fencing. He said the inspection yesterday had been documented and that my property was clear on all counts. He said I had some of the best documentation and care standards they'd seen in years, and that usually these kinds of cases were cut and dry, but because of the aggressive nature of Karen's complaint, things had to go a step further. I raised an eyebrow, pretending not to know what he meant. He grinned and said, "We're visiting your neighbor today. You might want to stay close to your porch." Delaney explained that when a cruelty case is filed, even falsely, and includes claims of animal behavior disturbance to others, the rule is to investigate all immediate surrounding animals to eliminate environmental triggers. That meant her dog was fair game now. Not that it needed to be based on the racket it made. According to his records, there had never been any valid registration for that dog. No chip, no rabies vaccine, no local tags, not even a valid ESA certification despite Karen's constant bragging that her dog was a trained support companion. In his words, if you're going to claim a cow is dangerous, maybe don't have a barking furball with no leash screaming bloody murder at every leaf. He asked if I'd mind giving a written statement about the incidents with Karen, including the meat she threw over the fence and the time she called the sheriff. I had already saved the footage. I handed him a flash drive with the time-stamped videos and said, "Here you go, officer." He looked surprised. "You don't happen to do this professionally, do you?" I laughed and told him no, but after years of dealing with tricky HOA neighbors, I had learned that keeping records wasn't paranoid, it was protection. I stayed on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee while Delaney and a second officer approached Karen's house. She must have seen them coming, because she opened the door in a full blazer and pearl necklace, like she was about to accept a community leadership award. She greeted them with fake concern, putting on an air of importance like she'd summoned them there herself. The dog, yappy as ever, barked nonstop at their feet. Delaney asked calmly for the vaccination record. Karen froze for a moment and then said, "They're in my safe, I just need to get my lawyer to unlock it." The other officer asked for the license number. She waved a hand and said, "The state made a mistake, they lost the file." It became obvious quickly that she didn't have anything. They handed her a warning notice, informing her she had 24 hours to produce valid documentation or the animal would be taken for safety evaluation and registration review. Karen's whole face changed. She started yelling about privacy, government overreach, and how the HOA would be hearing about this harassment. But she was shaking, gripping that dog like it would fly away if she let go. Her voice went up 2 octaves when they reminded her that since she had filed a formal cruelty complaint, she had triggered the inspection herself. That little detail hit her like a slap. Her expression turned from rage to pure disbelief. "You mean I did this?" she gasped. Delaney just nodded, straight-faced. The officers left her with the notice and walked back past my porch. Delaney gave me a little salute, then climbed into his truck. I nodded back and watched them leave. Karen stood in her driveway fuming, staring at the paper in her hand like it was an eviction letter from royalty. That night, I didn't hear the dog bark once. Not even a whimper. Maybe Karen was finally scared enough to muzzle it, or maybe she was desperately trying to forge some paperwork. Either way, the silence was better than television. The next morning, I went about my usual chores. By noon, I saw the same animal control truck rolling up again, this time slower. They stopped in front of Karen's house and stepped out with a small scanner, a leash, and a mobile evaluation kit. I couldn't help but lean against my gate and watch. She answered the door, not in pearls this time, but in yoga pants and a hoodie. The dog barked at their feet, and Karen looked disheveled, tired, and far less confident. She handed over a stack of papers, but from the way they scanned through them, I knew it wasn't good enough. One of the officers shook his head and quietly explained something. Karen started raising her voice again, but this time, there wasn't as much fire in it. Then came the moment. They asked for the dog. Karen refused. She stepped back into the doorway, clutching it. But the officer explained calmly that failure to comply would result in further citations and possibly a forced seizure warrant. Karen stood frozen. Then, slowly, she handed over the leash, sobbing as the dog was gently placed in the back of the mobile unit. The neighborhood was watching now. I saw 3 heads poking over fences, and someone recording from a second-story window. The moment the truck drove away, Karen dropped to her knees in her driveway and screamed. It wasn't a graceful cry. It was full-blown drama. Wailing. Hands in the air. She accused me of ruining her life. She said the HOA would hear about this. She said she was going to sue everyone, the officers, the city, even the cows. Yes, the cows. She shouted that the cows needed to be removed for emotional terrorism. I nearly choked on my lemonade. By evening, the neighborhood chat was flooded with posts about the incident. Someone posted a blurry photo of her handing over the dog, with the caption, "Justice for Moo." Another neighbor shared a clip of Karen yelling about cow conspiracies, and the comments section was brutal. Memes started popping up. My favorite one was a side-by-side of her barking dog and my silent cow with the caption, "Which one's really disturbing the peace?" The officers returned later that night to deliver a report to me. They confirmed Karen had failed all registration requirements and would be facing fines. The dog would be evaluated, and if not claimed legally within 5 days, rehomed. Delaney smiled as he handed me a copy and said, "You really do have the cleanest cows in the county." I thanked him and asked if this kind of thing happened often. He laughed and said, "Not quite like this. You've got first class." The silence didn't last. Karen may have handed over her dog, but the storm that followed made the previous drama look like a dress rehearsal. Less than 48 hours after Animal Control drove away with her yappy little sidekick, Karen launched a full-blown retaliation campaign against me and my cows. I didn't even see it coming at first. I was too busy enjoying the peace and getting caught up on things I hadn't done in weeks. For the first time in a while, I could hear birds instead of barking. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had learned her lesson. That hope lasted until Tuesday morning, when I discovered raw hamburger meat scattered along the fence line of my pasture. At first, I thought maybe an animal had dragged it there, but the placement was too deliberate. Perfectly round patties, still frozen in some parts, tossed every few feet along the fence like breadcrumbs in a twisted fairy tale. I knew exactly who did it. Karen was trying to bait something into my field. Coyotes, raccoons, maybe even stray dogs. I gathered up the meat carefully with gloves and called Animal Control again, not to report her this time, but to add to the growing file they already had on her behavior. I also handed over more security footage. My night vision camera had caught her, hood up, flashlight in hand, tossing meat while whispering angrily to herself. I don't know what she was muttering, but at one point she shouted something about bovine revenge and had to duck behind a bush when she tripped on her own flip-flop. That same afternoon, I found that someone had left a series of laminated flyers on every mailbox down the road. The headline in bright red read, "Danger, Unmonitored Livestock." Beneath it was a photo of one of my cows yawning that Karen had clearly edited to make it look like the animal was snarling. The caption claimed that multiple neighbors had been endangered and that livestock sounds were triggering anxiety attacks. At the bottom, in fine print, it said, "Sponsored by concerned citizens for a quieter community," which was hilarious because the only person who had ever filed a complaint about my cows was Karen. A few neighbors texted me the flyer with laughing emojis. Others just shook their heads and asked what her problem was. I told them I didn't know. Maybe she thought this was a personal feud with some epic stake. Maybe she was bored. Or maybe she just couldn't stand not being the center of attention. Regardless, it was getting old fast. That's when someone in the neighborhood suggested I share the full story online. Not just in the group chat. Not just with a few friends. But somewhere public. I'd lurked on Reddit for years. I followed subs like r/PettyRevenge and r/EntitledPeople, but I'd never posted anything myself. That night, I sat down, loaded all the footage, documented the timeline from her first complaint to the dog seizure, and wrote the most detailed post I could. I didn't use her real name. I just called her Karen like everyone else did. I attached screenshots, photos, and video links, hit publish, and went to bed. By morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Hundreds of upvotes. thousands by lunchtime. The story had hit the front page of r/EntitledPeople and was starting to spread to other subreddit. The comments were unreal. People were laughing, asking for updates, making memes. One person said they would pay to see the cow moo in court. Another dubbed the story Moo vs. Karen, Dawn of Utter Justice. Someone even offered to animate the entire saga as a cartoon short. But Karen? She wasn't laughing. The next morning, she stormed over to my fence and shouted that I had violated her privacy. She demanded I delete the post and accused me of cyberbullying. I reminded her, calmly, that I never mentioned her name or her address, and that everything I shared was either public record or captured on my own property. That sent her over the edge. She threatened to sue me for emotional damage, libel, defamation, and psychic distress. I asked if she wanted a fresh cup of delusion with that tantrum. She didn't think it was funny. The very next day, Animal Control came back. This time they had 2 trucks, a clipboard, and an animal behaviorist in tow. Apparently, Karen had attempted to reclaim her dog but failed to provide any documents once again. Worse, she claimed the seizure was illegal and filed a formal complaint against the officers. That triggered a deeper investigation, not just of her, but of every case she had filed in the past 2 years. According to Delaney, she had logged nearly 40 complaints across 4 departments, most of them anonymous but traceable. They wanted to review every incident: the meat throwing, the noise complaints, the fake flyers. They even took copies of the Reddit post, which by now had attracted attention from a few local journalists. One news blog reached out for an interview. I declined. I didn't want to make it worse. But the damage was already done. Karen was in deep, and she knew it. The final straw came that weekend when they officially served her with a notice of civil penalties for false reporting, animal neglect, and harassment. The fines were steep. The paperwork thick. She tried to argue again, but this time she didn't have the crowd on her side. Word had spread through the community. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down started speaking up. One couple admitted Karen had tried to get their outdoor cats removed because she was allergic to fur in the air. Another neighbor confessed she had called code enforcement on them for having a hammock between 2 trees. One guy said she once tried to shut down his barbecue for smoke pollution. People were done with her nonsense. And then, the cherry on top, one of the animal control officers, new to the team, recognized Karen's house from an old internal complaint. Apparently, months ago, someone in that same unit had flagged her address because she tried to pass off a Chihuahua as a therapy goat to get past pet limit. That story had been buried due to lack of follow-through. Now it was reopened. Karen was now facing an investigation not just for false complaints but for serial misrepresentation of animals. I didn't even know that was a thing, but apparently it is when you keep making stuff up. The officers returned her dog to a rescue shelter where it could be legally rehomed. Karen stood in her driveway, tears streaking her face, blaming everyone but herself. She yelled that the HOA would cover her legal bills, that she had powerful friends. But her voice was weaker now. Even her posture had changed. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked tired, desperate, and a little bit lost. A few hours later, she posted printed signs on every pole in the neighborhood saying she was forming a new HOA subcommittee to address livestock pollution and neighborhood trauma. No one responded. Not even the other HOA members. One neighbor took the signs down and taped them back to her door with a note that read, "Please heal in private." By the end of the week, my cows were back to their regular routine, chewing grass, swatting flies with their tails, and ignoring the chaos they had unknowingly inspired. I spent my evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees, thinking about how bizarre it was that a feud over mooing had turned into a viral sensation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really about the cows. It never was. It was about someone who couldn't stand not being in control. And when she realized she wasn't, she fell apart. I should have known Karen wouldn't go down without swinging at something, even if it was just the air around her. When people like her start to lose control, they don't reflect or apologize. They plot. Less than a week after the dog incident, the Reddit explosion, and the neighborhood turning against her, I received an official-looking envelope taped to my gate. I thought maybe it was another one of her ridiculous flyers, but no. This was real. It was a court summons. Karen had filed a small claims suit against me for emotional distress, defamation, and what she described as livestock terrorism. I almost choked on my coffee laughing when I read the phrase, intentional mooing in a targeted manner to disrupt the peace and emotional security of the plaintiff. She had actually written that, with a straight face, and now I had to go to court over it. I showed the letter to a friend of mine who happened to be a retired attorney. He blinked 3 times, read it again, and said, "She really filed this?" I nodded. He leaned back in his chair and said, "This is going to be the most ridiculous legal circus you'll ever be part of, but let me help you make sure it's also the most satisfying." And so we got to work. I gathered every shred of evidence I had. The footage of her tossing meat, the recorded phone calls to animal control, the laminated flyers, the Reddit post, the security cam videos, and even the HOA group chat where neighbors described her years of harassment. I organized everything into a neat binder with color-coded tabs. I didn't want to just win. I wanted the judge to understand exactly who this woman was. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom looked more like a high school auditorium than a battleground. Still, the tension was thick. Karen walked in wearing a charcoal pantsuit and sunglasses indoors, holding a stack of what looked like handwritten notes and manila folders. I half expected her to whip out a laser pointer and a pie chart. She kept glancing over at me with smug confidence, like she was about to expose a great conspiracy. I sat quietly, hands folded, with my binder resting on my lap. When the judge entered and called our case, Karen immediately stood up and began what can only be described as a dramatic performance. She claimed I had created an environment of emotional violence. She accused my cows of mooing at deliberately inconvenient times. She insisted my post on Reddit had endangered her safety and reputation. She said she could no longer take walks in her own yard without fear of bovine harassment. The judge, an older woman with no patience for nonsense, raised an eyebrow and asked if she had any medical or legal documentation supporting her claims. Karen started fumbling with her papers, offering printed screenshots of anonymous Reddit comments and one blurry photo of a cow staring in her direction from 50 feet away. She called it photographic evidence of intimidation. Then it was my turn. I opened my binder and started with a calm explanation of my background, my property boundaries, and how none of my land was part of the HOA Karen lived in. I walked the court through the timeline of events, using printed photos, video stills, and reports from animal control. I submitted the official documentation showing her dog was unlicensed, unvaccinated, and previously the subject of a false ESA claim. I even included a copy of the handwritten complaint she submitted with her claim of moo terrorism. When I read that phrase aloud, someone in the back of the courtroom actually laughed, and the judge had to ask for silence. I closed by explaining that I had not sought this conflict, that I had only responded to escalating harassment with lawful measures and community transparency. I stated that my animals had always been cared for within legal standards, and that the Reddit post had omitted her name and any identifying details. It was the community who connected the dots because of her long pattern of behavior. The judge flipped through the documents silently for a few minutes, then looked up and asked Karen one question. "Have you, at any point, made a formal complaint to the proper authorities regarding any of these claims?" Karen said yes. "And what was the result?" "They took my dog," she snapped, loud enough that her voice echoed. The judge raised an eyebrow again, and then leaned forward. Her ruling was swift and scathing. She dismissed the case entirely, citing it as frivolous and retaliatory. She warned Karen that further misuse of the legal system could result in sanctions. She also added that livestock sounds in rural zones were not considered disturbances under local ordinances, and that mooing was not, under any circumstances, a basis for emotional distress claims. Karen looked like she'd just been slapped with a shovel. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but no sound came out. She stood there for a long moment, then stormed out, papers flapping behind her like broken wings. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I'd just won an Oscar for Best Revenge without lifting a finger. But the story didn't end there. The civil penalties from animal control continued piling up for Karen. Fines for the unlicensed dog. Fines for false reporting. Warnings for potential harassment. Someone on the HOA board leaked to me that she had been unofficially warned to step down as the self-proclaimed president. Turns out she never even held a valid position. She just bullied people into letting her act like she did. The HOA quietly held an emergency meeting without her. By the end of that week, Karen was officially removed from any committee position she ever claimed to hold. Her reign of laminated flyers and over-the-fence shouting had come to an end. I didn't celebrate publicly. I just spent more time with the cows, gave them extra apples, and installed a new sign by the front gate that read, "Moo respectfully, you're on camera." The cows didn't care. They just wanted snacks. Then came the twist no one saw coming. A neighbor named Carla knocked on my door one morning holding a folder. She said, "I think you should see this." Inside were copies of complaints Karen had filed over the last 2 years. Carla had gotten them through a public records request. There were dozens of them. Some were about me. Others were about nearly every household within 5 lots of hers. Noise. Smells. Lawn colors. Kids playing too loud. Someone flying a kite too close to her patio. One guy got a formal letter because his sprinkler made a puddle near the sidewalk. It wasn't just me. It had never been just me. Karen had been waging war against the entire neighborhood, one petty complaint at a time. With the help of a few neighbors, Carla was organizing a group to present a class action complaint to the HOA for harassment and damages. I didn't want to lead it, but I agreed to contribute evidence. I gave them footage, emails, the Reddit thread, and a full copy of the court transcript. The group moved fast. Within 2 weeks, Karen had a letter taped to her door informing her that she was under review by the HOA disciplinary panel. No one showed up to support her. The neighborhood had moved on. People were happier, friendlier. Kids played outside again. Dogs barked and no one flinched. And my cows? They became local celebrities. I had just started to believe things were finally settling down when Karen made her last desperate move, one that was so absurd, so wildly out of touch with reality, that at first I thought it had to be a joke. After the court case had been dismissed, her dog officially rehomed, and her role in the HOA publicly erased, Karen disappeared for a while. She stopped yelling over the fence, stopped tossing flyers, and even stopped pretending to jog past my gate to glare at my cows. For about 2 weeks, her house was quiet. The blinds were always drawn, the porch lights stayed off, and nobody saw her walk her yard. Most of the neighborhood thought she'd finally accepted defeat. I should have known better. Karen wasn't built to lose with grace. She was built to explode. It started on a Sunday morning. I was fixing a section of the pasture fence when I heard the sound of a loudspeaker crackling. It was followed by Karen's voice, echoing across the field like some kind of political rally. She had set up a portable speaker system on her porch and began what can only be described as a sermon. She stood on her front steps in a bright blue dress with a stack of notes, reading loudly about animal noise pollution, rural abuse of urban harmony, and something she called cow-based psychological warfare. Her speech accused me, by name, of orchestrating a personal vendetta, manipulating the court system, and brainwashing the neighborhood through social media. The neighbors came out onto their porches in disbelief. Some stood there in stunned silence. Others filmed it. One kid across the street held up a giant bucket of popcorn. Karen shouted that she was forming a new citizens' alliance against farm animal harassment. She called it Residence for Suburban Peace, or RSP for short, though everyone started jokingly calling it Really Silly People instead. She passed out printed petitions, most of which were left sitting on the curb or blown into the road. No one signed. She then began sending mass emails to the neighborhood, claiming she was going to appear on local news to tell her story. She even claimed to have retained legal counsel, though when asked for details, she said the name was confidential for strategic legal reasons. The truth was, she was alone. Her meltdown was happening in slow motion and everyone could see it, but things turned serious again when she tried to get the county involved. She sent a formal letter to the zoning board claiming that my cows were part of an unlicensed petting zoo. She argued that because people had visited in the past for school trips or neighbor gatherings, I was running a commercial enterprise without permit. I had to respond, once again, with paperwork, videos, timestamps, and letters from the actual zoning office proving that my land was legally designated for livestock and agricultural use. The county dismissed her claim within 48 hours and included a warning that repeated frivolous filings could lead to a civil fine. That just made her angrier. Her next stunt was the one that finally tipped the balance permanently. One morning, I woke up to find my pasture had been partially spray-painted. Someone had snuck over during the night and left giant, shaky letters in orange paint spelling out the words Moo Menace. It wasn't even clever. But what made it worse was that she had also spray-painted one of the cows. Melissa, my friendliest and oldest, had a bright streak of orange down her side. Thankfully, the paint was non-toxic, and the vet confirmed she wasn't harmed, but the intent was malicious and the act itself was criminal. I called the sheriff immediately. Surveillance footage made the rest easy. Karen had crept through the side fence gate in the early morning hours wearing all black, carrying a small bag, and fumbling with the spray can. Her face was clearly visible in the camera feed. When the deputies knocked on her door, she tried to say it was an old video, doctored to frame her. But they'd already matched the paint from the pasture to a can found in her recycling bin. She was cited for trespassing, property damage, and animal harassment. This time, there was no wiggle room. The arrest didn't happen that day. But the charges stuck, and she was ordered to appear in court once again. Word spread quickly. This wasn't just a neighborhood drama anymore. Now she was facing real consequences for her actions. The same people who had once been indifferent to her antics were now testifying against her. One man recounted how she had screamed at his teenage daughter for playing music too loudly during a birthday party. Another couple shared how she used to record their family dinners from her window and send emails about illegal food smells. She had spent so long targeting everyone that now, when she needed support, not a single soul stood by her side. The day she left was strange. There was no big scene, no shouting, no more loudspeakers. A moving truck pulled up in the early morning hours, and by noon she was gone. The blinds never opened. The porch stayed empty. A few curious neighbors walked past slowly to confirm it was real. Her house sat still and silent for a week before a real estate sign went up. Word on the street was that she'd moved to a smaller place in another district. Someone claimed they saw her in line at the DMV complaining about birds near the parking lot, but no one could confirm. After she was gone, the neighborhood changed in small but powerful ways. People started waving at each other again. Kids played in the streets without fear of being filmed. Backyard barbecues returned. Someone organized a community potluck, and Melissa got a special veggie cake made from carrots and apples. I brought out a little sign that said Karen Free Zone and placed it next to the fence. It got more laughs than I expected. One neighbor said we should bronze it. The Reddit post became a full-blown saga. I updated it with the final chapter, including her court charges and quiet exit. The thread blew up again. People from all over the world commented with stories of their own Karens. Some were sad. Some were hilarious. But most of them ended the same way mine did, with a community finally standing up and saying enough. A month after her departure, Officer Delaney stopped by again. He handed me a thank you card from the local animal services department. Inside was a note saying they had updated training materials based on Karen's case. Apparently, they now used my footage in presentations about handling false reports and recognizing patterns of neighbor harassment. I couldn't believe it. My cow saga had become part of a government slideshow. Delaney chuckled and told me that if I ever wanted a job teaching patience to new officers, I had a standing offer. I thanked him and walked him out to the fence. Melissa wandered over and licked his sleeve. He laughed and said, "That cow's a local hero now." I nodded and looked out across the pasture. The sun was setting, the sky painted in gold and orange, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. No shouting, no barking, no flyers flapping in the wind. Just peace. Looking back, I never would have imagined that one entitled woman and her unlicensed dog could start a chain of events that led to community reform, legal training updates, and international Reddit fame. But that's exactly what happened. And I didn't have to raise my voice, or throw a punch, or do anything outrageous. I just stood my ground, documented the truth, and